behind you, we've got the historical voice. I'm one of those, and you take it for what you will, but I'm one of those that believe this actually happened. Gideon was a real dude. And then you have the moral teaching. And I think the moral teaching, or the general teaching that you would get from today's lesson, would be learning to trust God. I think when we talk about the story of God whittling down Gideon's army, that's what we're going to talk about today. It's finding your hope and your strength in God, and not in yourself. Not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord, and that He is the one that will deliver you. But of course, we are on the hunt for that gospel witness, and we want to make sure that we're looking for Jesus in these scriptures. So we're actually going to be looking at, let's look first at 1 through 8. And so then Jerubbaal, do you remember what Jerubbaal means? Anyone? It means one who contends with Baal. So they changed Gideon's name then to Jerubbaal, one who contends with Baal, because he tore down Baal's altar. And so all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And just right off the bat, the whole story of Gideon overcoming the Midianites. If you remember, the word Midian in Israel was synonymous with enemy. You could say of someone, in a derogatory fashion, you're such a Midian, meaning you're an enemy to me. Come and join us, Carlos. So, Carlos, we're in Judges 7. We're looking at verses 1 through 8. And so we just read the first verse, but I'll read it again. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And that's as far as we got. But it was this getting up early and going to the spring of Harod. Now, this is where this whole thing is sort of, this is where this story takes place, is at this spring. But this spring, in the camp of Midian, the enemy was north of them by the hill of Moreh, however you want to pronounce it, which means the hill of bitterness, in the valley. So, and I personally believe that hill of Moreh represents the cross, and that's where we saw Jesus crucified. And yet here they got up early and went to the spring. And I think the spring in this story, and you'll see it kind of work itself out, I believe. I think the spring in this story represents us leaning on the power of the Holy Spirit in order to confront the enemy. That you can't confront the enemy without it. But you'll see what I mean when we work our way through these verses. So in verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many. Have you ever, can you imagine us having a church service and me saying, there are too many people here. We need half of you to go home. Yeah. And it may be in this environment with Corona, we might actually have to say that at some point. Who knows? But the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many, and for me to give the Midianites, the enemy, into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. And so God makes it pretty clear as to why he thinks you have too many. He doesn't want you to get a big head. He doesn't want you to think that you did it in your own strength. And in verse 3, now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Hurry away. So he says, those who are afraid, send them home. And it's more. It's not even so much send them home, but let them. It's almost like an act of grace that God doesn't want them to go into this battle fearful. And the thing is what happens when you are afraid is I think you're in more danger when you're when you're afraid. When you're calm, cool, and collected, right? Rather than spastic. To be calm, cool, and collected, you make wise decisions. You make right decisions. But when you're not, when you're distracted, when you're hot-headed, then you make bad decisions, and it's more dangerous for you anyway. And so fearful people are in more danger during a battle than those who are not afraid. Now, it doesn't mean that these people had no fear. It just means that they were not trembling, they weren't shaking in their boots. And I think it's more of an act of grace that God's saying, let them go home. And we don't want them there anyway. It's probably not going to be good for them. Then 22,000. Now that is a gulper, right?
Yeah. It's like desertion.
He had 32,000, 22,000 left. And so if I were Gideon, I'd be like,
Yeah.
So only 10,000 people remained, and you're like, whew, I don't know if I can do this with 10,000. So Gideon's already starting to feel maybe like he doesn't have what is necessary to face the enemy. And so in verse 4, the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. I mean,
God confirmed
come on,
Gideon was. He couldn't handle that.
You still have too many people. So take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go with you. So he's already weeded out, not weirded out. He's already weeded out the fearful, right? And so now he's going to weed out some others. And he does this interesting test. And it depends on what version of the Bible you're reading as to how confusing this text is. The original, most authentic texts that we can find, it's worded like what I'm going to read for you. But in other versions, they don't like it because it doesn't make sense. It's kind of like that whole second bowl issue. It's like, what? Why? And it causes trouble, and they think, oh, the text must be corrupted. And so the same thing happens in this little verse here. But I think, and even though this is the original one, I kind of appreciate what the NIV does. I think the NIV, in my opinion, again, hold that, my opinion and a quarter won't even get you a cup of coffee these days. So in my opinion, the NIV gets it right, but the ESV, this one, which translates according to our, the oldest text that we can find, translates it like this. So in verse 5, so he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Now, instantly, what is the image that comes to your mind when you read that verse 5? Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps. What is this person doing?
Submitting?
Huh?
Submitting?
Well, yeah, but I mean, what are they doing? If you were to describe someone as drinking water with their tongue as a dog laps from this pool,
Kneeling.
Well, they're kneeling, but what else are they doing?
They're drinking.
They're drinking, but how are they drinking? With a cup?
Like a dog.
Like a dog. How does a dog drink?
Backs it up.
Put their right.
Go ahead, show us.
You got it all in your head, right? This person is down on all fours,
Yes.
and they've got their face, and they're sucking up water, right? That's the image that lapping up water. Well, but by the way, humans cannot lap like dogs lap.
No.
We don't have the ability to do it with our tongue.
Just like Lucy cheated on us again.
Yeah.
What?
But how do dogs when they're thirsty? I mean,
They go.
right? And it's like you can talk to them and they ignore you. Nothing, right? And so there's a way a dog laps water, right? And so here, if we continue though, it says, everyone who laps water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. So there's the distinction. Those who kneel and those who lap. But then read verse 6 in the ESV. I don't know what versions you all have, but in the ESV, and the number of those who lapped putting their hands to their mouths was 300. Now, isn't that confusing? It says there were those who drank like dogs and those who knelt like this and drank from cupped hands. Now, which one of those drinks like dogs? I don't know. And it's this very confusing text. And most of us here had the ESV, and it says, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And verse 6, and the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And it's just like, wait, which one's lapping like a dog and which one's drinking, from their hand? And it gets confusing. And so some scholars take that cupped hand things and they just move it to the end of the sentence, to those who knelt down and drank with cupped hands. And it makes a lot more sense in our brains that way.
Yeah.
But, but I was like, well, that's not what the original text says.
Is it like the ones who drink like dogs, sinners, and the ones that drink like this?
Well,
But they're all.
I don't know, but because he keeps the ones that drink like dogs.
In this whole scenario, they have to kneel down.
yeah.
Everybody has to get down, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But there's some debate. Are they doing this, kneeling, drawing a cup of water, and doing this, or are they getting down on all fours and drinking
I don't
like
think
this?
I'd be doing that.
And now, so here's the thing. I tested this out.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
I put 2 big bowls on the floor in my kitchen.
Gosh.
I bet
I hope you were alone at the time.
Well, Levi was there.
I bet Levi had a ball with it.
I put 2 big bowls in the kitchen, and I knelt the way that they describe. Well, see, these men who kneel, they would have been more aware and looking around, and they would do this. And the thing is, I tried it, and to get to kneel down and get a cup of water in your hand, or even if you do 2 hands, okay, you don't get very much water. Most of it ends up on you and on the floor. Okay, and you get a little tiny taste. But if you get down on all fours and you put your face down in that water, you start sucking. You can drink a lot of water really fast.
Yeah, that's
And so I would say if you were thirsty, there's one way you would do it.
Yeah.
And if you weren't thirsty, there's another way you would do it.
Right.
Okay? And here's my opinion. Again, this opinion might be worth 50 cents because I actually did a test instead of just 25 cents. In my opinion, I think that God wants the thirsty. He wants those that drink like dogs. He doesn't want those that are timid about drinking from the well, that are more dependent upon, looking around and being aware, because they're not very far from the enemy camp at this point. But these guys who are like, put their weapons down and they're all in. They're not paying attention to anything going on but getting a big old drink. And only 300 of the 10,000 do that. And those are the ones that God keeps. For 2 reasons, I think. One, because those are the least likely men that you would choose to go to war with you. But also, they're thirsty. And and so when we're looking at the gospel story here, if that spring represents that drinking deep from the Spirit, he wants those who are thirsty for the Spirit, not those who are dependent upon self, but those who are thirsty for him. So in verse 7, it said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man, to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And then the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So you get this vision of this valley that's so many enemies that they couldn't even count them. It says their camels were as the sand of the seas. It's that there's so many Midianites, Amalekites, other people from the east joined Midian, and they're like, we're really going to go to town in Israel here. And remember a couple weeks ago, you know, Gideon tears down the altar to Baal and he cuts down the Asherah. And when you start to fight the enemy in your own life, it's like poking the hornet's nest. It's like, you know, we say the enemy gets defensive real quick, and you can, and it goes real good. And we talk about having 2 trees to choose from. There's always going to be another tree, and there's always going to be this opportunity for Gideon to turn tail and run. It never gets easier for him. It's like, I did that. That's great. God was with me. Oh, this is really going good. I've got 32,000 men here to fight the enemy. This is amazing, you know. This is just going to be awesome. And God whittles it down to 300 guys. And I think
if you're speaking directly with God, isn't that
Yeah.
gonna give you a little boost?
it does, right?
I mean,
Intimacy with
really.
God gives you a boost. It does.
More confidence, you know.
I think
We'll
so.
make it with 300.
I think so. Yeah.
Says so.
We'll discover that Gideon's still frightened.
No.
But God is faithful,
Does
okay?
it say how many Midianites there were?
So
Couldn't
too
see
many to
all.
count.
Too many to count.
Too many to count. That's how many. And so verse 9 tells us an interesting story, and you'll see the gospel all over this one. But that same night, the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand." So who is giving it? The Lord, right? But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. So here's Gideon. God knows Gideon's frame, first of all. He said, I want you to go down into their camp. This is like just to go visit. Middle of the night, Gideon's supposed to go into the enemy camp. And he's like, Gideon, I know you're going to be afraid, but I want you to take Purah with you. I'm going to highlight Purah. Purah only shows up one time in Scripture, and that's right here. Okay, it never shows up again. But Purah, the name means fruitful branch, to be a fruitful branch. And so you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. And I think it means, you know, what does Jesus said in John 15? If you abide in me and I abide in you, you know, you will bear much fruit. And so Purah, this fruitful branch, it's like this invitation that God's saying, I want you to go down into the camp. I'm going to be with you. You're going to be with me. And we're going to do this thing. And you'll know that I'm with you, and your hand's going to be strengthened against the enemy. So in the middle of verse 11, then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. So there's so many, they eat just their camels. You couldn't even count their camels. There were so many. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. I love this dream. Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of the Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. So this enemy tent was destroyed by what?
A barley cake.
Yeah.
A barley cake?
Bread.
Barley
Bread,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
okay.
It's a bread roll.
Okay.
And Jesus is what?
The bread of life.
Yes, Carlos, you get 100% today. All right, so
Even though
Jesus,
I'm late.
yep, Jesus is the bread of life, and I love the fact that it doesn't just strike the tent, that it falls. It turns it upside
Humble.
down, right? It turns it upside down, and the tent lay flat. So the enemy's house is destroyed by the bread that
They
rolls
just
into
happened
camp.
to hit it at that place.
Right. And his comrade answered. So here's what gets me too is the enemy knows good and well what's about to happen. This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. They can tell that from this dream about bread rolling into the camp, but this is Gideon coming to town and he's going to destroy us all. And so it strikes me that the enemy fears Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, and yet when we face spiritual darkness, we turn to just almost anywhere but Jesus, you know, as humans. You know, we turn to finances, we turn to politics, we turn to medicine. And it's not that those things cannot be useful tools in the hands of God, but it's got to be in the hands of God. If it's not in the hands of God, then at best they'll distract you away from God. And so the enemy fears the Lord, but we do not. There's this story, I don't even know if it's true, but it's just so funny, that about the church, and the guy opened up a bar right next door to the church, and the church didn't like it, and so they were having prayer meetings that God would shut down the bar, and then the bar got struck by lightning, and so the bar owner sued the church. And they went to court, and it was like, everybody knew that they didn't like my bar. Everybody knew that they were praying that God would shut my bar down. And then my bar got struck by lightning, and I had to close down. And so I know it's their fault. And the church is like, we cannot be blamed for this. This is not our fault. We didn't have anything to do with the closing of this bar. And the judge responded, it is very clear to me that this bar owner has more faith than the church. You know, and
He
this,
knows you're responsible.
and it's like, I don't know that that's a true story, but just that the whole idea of how the enemy sees God for who he really is, but we do not. You know, when David went up against Goliath, he didn't say, hey, I know how to use a sling. I'm really good at it. He said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that would defy the armies of the living God? You know, not because we're Israel and we're all that. It's like, no, we're the armies of the living God. So David had a vision of his God that was bigger than the giant. And it wasn't his skill with a sling. It wasn't his ability to kill lions and bears. It was because he knew that his God was real. And then there's a reason he calls them uncircumcised. Because they didn't have a covenant relationship with him. But we do. You know, and that's the thing. When we go up against the enemy, we don't go in there saying, because I've read my Bible today, that's why I can. No, it's because I'm his child. And I have a covenant relationship with God. It's because of the blood of the Lamb, not by any other means. You know, that's what Paul makes it clear. It is by grace. It is by faith. It is not by human strength. It's not by works. So it's not what we do. It's all what he does. And so it's important for us to remember the enemy, they know who Jesus is, and they're afraid of him. And we need to have as big a vision of who Jesus is as our enemy does, if not bigger. And so he needs to be magnified in our own eyes. And one of the ways we do that is through worship. We do that through spending time in prayer and reading the word. But we need to develop a bigger vision of who Jesus is and how capable and able our God is.
You can be surprised when our prayers answered.
Right. You're like, well, I didn't expect. Why didn't you
Yeah, we
expect
say-
that?
We're surprised.
Yeah,
Look what God
But
did.
they're not answered every time. To our
They're answered, but
satisfaction.
But yeah, rarely
Yeah.
to our satisfaction.
Yeah.
That's right. All right, verse 15. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. And so that's what I'm like, you know, this helped Gideon to understand that the God that was with him was bigger than what the Midianite army was. Remember, I mean, just before that, it talks about how big the enemy is. It lays that out for you on purpose. It says, look at how big the enemy is. You can't even count them. You're in big trouble, Gideon. Oh, but this bread's going to roll into camp.
Yeah. I mean, I picture this big rock and a wily coyote is
Yeah.
running in his rocks.
That's the same image I have. It's just this bread rolls into camp. And a bread roll? Of all things, a bread roll? And yet that's the beauty and the wisdom of the cross. Is we don't think the enemy thought. I believe the enemy thought he won that day. The Son of God is dead. We did it, but nope. You know, he
No.
come in and he turned their tent upside down, and it's a good thing. So as soon as Gideon hears this, it's like his vision of who God is increased. He now has a bigger vision of who God is and who's with him. And so what does he do? He worships. And that should be our response. We worship. And he returned to the camp of Israel and he said, "Get up."
Let me tell you something.
"Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. So 3 groups of 100. And he puts trumpets. Now these are those like shofars. These are not like, cornets. These are like a ram's horn that they blow. Okay. And he put the trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars with torches inside the jars. So he gives them clay pots with torches inside and shofars. And he doesn't say anything about weapons. He just gives them these things and he says, "Look at me and do likewise." In other words, do what I do. Do what I do. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So you have this middle of the night, right? You got some guys down there in camp that are already scared because of this dream, and they already believe that Gideon's coming, right? And so I imagine him, and again, I can't prove this, but in my mind's eye, that sort of has spread around a little bit. People are like, "Ooh, this is the dream and this is the interpretation." They are already expecting Gideon with his army to show up and kill them. And then out of nowhere, they hear, right, up in the hills. And then they hear it from over here, and then they hear it from over here, and then the hillside lights up because they break their pots and the torches. They're all holding torches, and the torches are spread all around the hillsides surrounding the army of Midian. And I've heard all kinds of stories on warfare and things that explain, what is happening here, but fear had already gripped the heart of the enemy. I don't even know that it was necessary to have 300 torches. I think just the one torch would have done it. But, they talk about how normally you wouldn't have a torch for every person. You would have a torch for a cohort. The one person leading the way and everybody else is just following them. And so when they saw that many torches, they, in their minds, maybe, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard this teaching that in their minds, they would have added numbers to each torch that they saw. They wouldn't have just assumed it was just that line. They would have assumed there was a large army behind those torches as well, which makes sense because of what we'll discover, and we'll get into that a little bit next week. I don't want to get too far, but they'll discover that what happens when they fall apart at the seams. This enemy falls apart at the seams. Fears grip their hearts. There's 100 men over here, 100 men over here, 100 men over here. The hillside lights up, and they hear these trumpets, and it just reminds me again of just that sound of battle, when it's coming, and you're afraid already. And what happens is they end up killing each other, because when you're afraid, you make mistakes. When you're afraid, you do silly things and you shoot your own foot. And so fear is always a bad steering wheel. It never takes you in the right direction. But the empty jars, it is Paul who tells us that we have this treasure in jars of clay, and that you carry the light in you. And I often tell people when they're afraid, listen, it was when I was growing up, my mom used to tell me every morning when I went to school, because I hated going to school. I mean, it was just like, I wouldn't even try and fake being sick. I would just cry and say, I don't like going to school, you know. And she still made me go, but I despised it every day. And she would tell me every single day, now, David, Jesus is with you. You're not alone, you know. And it wasn't, you know, you don't have, he's not just with you, he's in you. And it's to this day, when I get done talking with my mom on the phone, she says, Jesus is in you, you know. And it's just that whole idea that how do you defend a lion? You know, you don't need to. You just let it out of its cage. It will take care of itself. And so they have this light, this torch, and it's in this clay pot. And the best way to defeat the enemy is get your light out. And that really is what terrified them. It wasn't their swords. They didn't even see their swords.
Did
Right.
they have any swords?
Well, we'll find out later that they did, because what's interesting, and we won't get to it today, but instead of, Gideon says, shout for the Lord and for Gideon, and the army then shouts a sword for the Lord, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not what Gideon told him to say. Right? So they're not quite at the
Yeah.
same place, I don't believe, that Gideon is at. You know,
Yeah.
Gideon has had his heart
Changed.
strengthened, you know, but his army maybe not so much. So, but they did have swords, and they did need them eventually, because they had to chase down the ones that ran away, and we'll learn about that next week too. And remember, when we talk about the gospel in these stories, you're always looking for death, and a burial, and a resurrection, and a mass redemption. But also, another thing that we're looking for is, I mean, we see the bread. We saw Gideon with in the wine press, and he was threshing the grain. We have the crucifixion there, but it's like you're also looking for that moment when you're able to crush the enemy's head. And that literally happens in this story again. Remember, we talked about it with Jael. You know, she grabbed that tent peg, and I mean, that's just a gruesome story, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You don't see that on Superbook. It's like, what would it be like to do like a VBS?
Based on that?
Yeah.
Or the beheading?
Where you told all of the gruesome stories
Yeah.
from the Bible. The boys would love it.
Yeah. Levi would say, I got my own hammer.
Yeah, I got a tent peg. Tent pegs for Jesus. Because we're all good, like with the torch and all that.